Welcome to the debate.
Today, our discussion dives into something that affects, well, millions of people trying to connect: dating apps.
That's right. We're looking specifically at a pretty serious claim that the actual business model behind these apps, the way they make money, fundamentally works against what they say they do, which is helping people find lasting relationships.
And this isn't just about tech or business models, is it? It really gets into behavioral psychology, economics, and frankly, the mental well-being of a huge number of users.
Absolutely. So the core question we're wrestling with today is this. Is all the frustration, the dating fatigue, the low success rates people experience, is that an intended consequence? Is it baked into a profit model that needs users to stick around? Or is it more a side effect of, well, how tricky modern dating is anyway, maybe mixed with how people misuse the platforms?
Okay, so that's the central conflict.
And my position is pretty clear. I believe these apps are fine-tuned for shareholder revenue above all else. They create this cycle, almost intentionally, of near misses and frustration using things like intermittent reinforcement, specifically to keep users single, maybe a bit anxious, and crucially, keep them paying. User success, in my view, is actually bad for business.
And I'm taking a slightly different angle. Look, I absolutely see let's call them perverse incentives in the structure. The model does encourage retention, but I don't think that automatically means active, malicious sabotage. I see these apps more as tools, maybe flawed tools, inefficient tools, sure. But success is still possible if users are strategic, if they're disciplined. I think a lot of the negative stuff comes from the design itself. That swipe mechanic is brutal. And also from users treating it like online shopping, that passive consumer mindset.
Okay, let's dig into that economic side first, because I think it really drives the whole thing. We're talking about a massive industry here. Match Group, that's Tinder, Hinge, OkCupid, a bunch of others, they pulled in something like $3.2 billion in 2024. Bumble added nearly another billion. So this is a $4 billion plus industry. And it only really thrives if its user base is kind of stuck, right? Stuck in that loop of almost finding someone, but not quite. That means they actively need to prevent customer loss, which in this context means preventing users from finding a relationship and leaving the app.
Okay, the scale is undeniable.
And how they prevent that loss is, I think, quite deliberate. There's this 4-phase model that seems almost perfectly engineered to create frustration. Phase 1 is what they call the hook. So you join, and according to MIT research, your profile gets an artificial boost. Suddenly, you're getting loads of matches, likes. It feels great. Big dopamine hit. You think, wow, okay, this actually works.
Right. It sets up this illusion of potential, maybe sets the expectation way too high initially.
Exactly. Which makes the next phase even more jarring. Phase 2, the throttle. After maybe 2 weeks, give or take, once you're psychologically kind of bought in, your visibility just tanks. Matches dry up. And that's when the frustration kicks in. You start thinking, what am I doing wrong? Is it me? But really, the algorithm has decided you're hooked, and now it can dial back the rewards.
Mm-hmm.
And this manufactured frustration leads pretty smoothly into phase 3, the monetization. Now the app starts nudging you. Hey, boost your profile, see who liked you. They offer these premium features that promise to get you back to that initial high.
Okay, but see, this is where I think our interpretations start to fork a bit on the intent. I'm not fully convinced this proves they want users to fail long-term. It definitely proves they want them to pay. What you're describing sounds like a classic freemium model strategy, doesn't it? Offer a taste, then charge for the full experience.
But here's the kicker. The data suggests that monetization is almost entirely about revenue, not about delivering actual success. Research out of Yale explicitly shows that these paid features, the expensive ones, have, and I quote, minimal impact on actual relationship formation. Minimal impact. Why? Because I argue the apps are mostly monetizing hope. The algorithm is still fundamentally controlling who sees you. Paying for a temporary boost might just bump you back up to the level you started at for free during that hook phase. The pool of potential partners hasn't magically improved, your compatibility hasn't changed, But the apps made money because you believed paying would fix the problem they created with the throttle.
Okay, framing it that way, linking the Yale finding directly back to the engineered throttle, that does paint a picture that's less about just a flawed product and maybe more about a deceptive one. That's a strong point.
Nate's in phase 4, the retention. The app keeps you hanging on through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. It keeps you hopeful, but ultimately unsatisfied. It's classic behavioral conditioning, like a Skinner box. They give you just enough reward. Maybe one really attractive match pops up after weeks of nothing to keep you swiping, keep you pulling that lever, even though most of the time you get nothing. They're essentially selling hope on an installment plan. Think about that case study mentioned in the source. Jake, the software engineer, spent $2,400 over 4 years, logged 1,500 hours swiping, and ended up with 0 relationships. From the app's perspective, though, that's an efficient model. It converted his time, his hope, his money directly into shareholder value. And maybe the worst part is it trains everyone involved to see other people as disposable commodities. Because, hey, there's always another swipe, right?
Yeah. Jake's case is definitely stark, and I won't deny those perverse incentives you've laid out. The system is structurally tilted towards keeping people engaged, maybe perpetually. But I still come back to the idea that these apps are tools, even if they're, let's say, incredibly inefficient ones. The economic model pushes retention, okay, but that does not automatically mean finding a relationship is absolutely impossible. I mean, the source material itself points to Stanford data suggesting it takes something like 25,000 swipes.
25,000?
Yeah, 25,000 swipes on average to find one viable relationship. Now, that number is staggering, I grant you. It highlights a colossal failure in efficiency in the sheer scale of the effort needed. But does it prove the business model requires absolute failure for everyone, or just that the tool is incredibly blunt?
But isn't that level of inefficiency, coupled with actively selling expensive, largely useless features to overcome it, isn't that basically sabotage by another name?
It's definitely problematic. Yet the research also suggests that if users approach these platforms strategically, they can sort of game the system, or at least mitigate the damage. A lot of the failure, I think, comes from users just passively consuming, endlessly swiping. The research offers very clear, actionable advice. For example, limiting use strictly to maybe 15 or 20 minutes a day. That's specifically aimed at reducing the anxiety, breaking that almost addictive loop.
So you're saying the answer to the addiction is just manage your consumption better? Okay, continue.
Well, yeah, manage the interaction and meet quickly. Don't get stuck in endless messaging. Aim for, say, 5 to 10 messages, then suggest meeting. Avoid building up that false pen pal intimacy that so rarely translates offline. Also, using video calls first. Stanford research backs this up. It cuts down dramatically on catfishing and wasting time on matches that just aren't right in person. And maybe most importantly, choosing the right app. Using platforms that require more effort upfront, think Hinge or OkCupid with their detailed profiles, rather than just swipe-only apps, tends to filter for more serious users and gives you a better shot at initial compatibility.
Okay, but those sound less like features proving the system works and more like necessary defensive maneuvers, right? Countermeasures against a system you admit is tilted against you.
You could see it that way, or you could see it as evidence that the platform can be made to serve the user's goal, but only if the user is disciplined and informed. And yes, the Princeton data is worrying. That correlation with 34% higher rates of anxiety and depression, lower self-esteem, it's significant. But we have to consider, couldn't some of that damage stem from the sheer paradox of choice, just being overwhelmed by options, and the constant high-volume exposure to rejection that feels inherent to mass-market dating itself, maybe amplified by the apps, but not necessarily solely created by malicious intent?
Well, that idea of qualitative degradation you just touched on, it leads us right back to the psychological cost, doesn't it? If the outcomes themselves tend to be poor, what's the emotional toll of sticking with it? I really want to challenge the idea that app-based connections are somehow equivalent to organic ones. I think the environment itself cultivates lower quality results.
Inferior in what specific way, though? people do meet and get married through these apps sometimes.
Okay, but let's look at the research again. MIT studies show pretty significant qualitative differences when you compare them to relationships formed organically. App-based couples show 40% higher rates of getting physically intimate early on, before a real emotional connection is built. There are also 58% higher rates of misrepresentation, people just not being who they seem online. And crucially, the apps foster what the researchers called a stronger consumer mentality.
Meaning, even if you're with someone, you're always kind of wondering if someone better is just another swipe away. That nagging feeling.
Precisely. And this leads to what's called rapid cycling. Relationships might spark quickly, maybe fueled just by proximity or initial attraction, but then they fizzle out just as fast when the next shiny potential match appears. The whole environment trains people to see others, and maybe relationships themselves, as disposable. It encourages low-quality, high-turnover connections.
I see your point about the consumer mentality being a corrosive influence. But again, I wonder, is the core issue the platform itself, or is it the sheer scale it operates on and how that scale changes behavior? These apps expose you to vastly more people than your immediate social circle ever could, and that has value. Yes, the rapid cycling is a real problem, I acknowledge that. But the strategic advice we talked about, like using those higher effort apps, isn't that designed precisely to counteract the superficiality? To force a better initial screening? Trying to mimic, even imperfectly, how shared social networks naturally filter for compatibility?
But let's circle back to the psychological harm, specifically the intent behind it, or at least the predictable outcome. If these were just inefficient tools, would the psychological fallout be quite so severe? That retention model, the intermittent reinforcement, I maintain it's actively damaging mental health. There's that University of Pennsylvania study, tracked 2,000 users. It found people spending more time on apps reported lower life satisfaction, more dating fatigue, increased cynicism, and here's the real kicker. Paradoxically, more loneliness, even though they technically had more connections.
That's a tough statistic to just brush aside. More loneliness despite more connections, it really does paint a picture of systemic disillusionment, doesn't it? More than just market inefficiency. That feels like direct evidence that the mechanism, likely fueled by the profit motive, is driving negative mental outcomes.
Exactly.
Okay, look, I'm definitely not arguing the effect isn't damaging. It clearly can be. But I still resist the premise that this damage is like a conscious corporate mandate. Think back to the earlier days of online dating, maybe the original Match.com era, before smartphones and swipe culture really took over around 2012. Success rates back then were actually pretty comparable to meeting people offline, in person.
So why the difference? What changed?
Well, back then, profiles usually required a lot more effort, right? And often there were significant monthly fees. That combination acted as a kind of screening process, mimicking social accountability to some degree. You had to invest real time, real money, which tended to mean you were more serious about the outcome. That financial and time investment naturally weeded out a lot of the purely casual users. So the underlying technology of meeting online wasn't inherently flawed. It's the mechanism that changed. This hyper-quantified, gamified, swipe-based model, that's what creates the disposable mindset, because it optimizes for quantity, for time spent scrolling, over actual quality interaction. Now, does that lead to mental fatigue, cynicism? Yes, absolutely, it seems to. But I still struggle to believe they sat around a table and said, okay, team, let's actively set out to destroy people's mental health.
But hang on, if the design choice maximizing time spent through swiping and intermittent rewards, if that consistently and predictably leads to cynicism and loneliness, and then that cynical, lonely user is potentially more likely to pay for a boost out of desperation, then isn't the design choice working exactly as the economic model intends? The motive doesn't have to be explicitly malicious. It just has to be profitable. And if damaging mental health is a profitable byproduct, the system selects for it.
The user does still have agency, though. They have to resist that constant temptation to pay for features that, as you pointed out from the Yale research, are largely ineffective. If a user goes in understanding the system is likely tilted, their responsibility then becomes to be strategic, to recognize that most premium features are primarily revenue drivers, not genuine relationship enhancers.
But that's putting a massive burden on the individual consumer, isn't it? especially someone who's already emotionally vulnerable, just looking for a real connection. And this constant emotional drain, this burden, is precisely why the evidence supporting organic, real-world alternatives is so compelling, and why I think the app model is fundamentally flawed at its core.
I don't disagree that organic connection is likely the gold standard, but we need to be careful about applying that data directly to everyone's reality today.
How so? The Yale studies are pretty clear. Relationships form through shared activities, through social networks. They have 40% lower divorce rates, report higher satisfaction, better conflict resolution. Columbia University research confirms that these shared social networks provide built-in accountability and natural compatibility screening. The app model seems to strip away exactly those elements: the social context, the repeated low-stakes exposure, the mutual accountability that seem crucial for lasting bonds.
Right, the research definitely shows what the apps remove are often the key ingredients for relationship success. The best path, arguably, is to quit the apps entirely.
Yes.
I absolutely cannot argue against the inherent superiority of organic methods. Empirically, they seem better because they offer that natural filtering for compatibility. However, where that research sometimes falls short is addressing the sheer time cost and logistical challenge of organic searching in today's world compared to the incredibly low-friction accessibility the apps provide. Think about someone working long hours, maybe someone new to a city. For many people in 2025, the apps, despite all their serious flaws, might feel like the only viable option just to get exposure to potential partners. Are we really comparing like with like?
But relying on a tool that's demonstrably optimized for your failure feels like walking willingly into a trap. The best strategy, the one modeled by people who actually found success after ditching the apps like Jake in the case study, seems to be reinvesting that time, that energy, that money into building a real-world presence, joining activity groups, becoming a regular somewhere. That's where the accountability and, likely, the higher quality interactions reside.
And I agree, quitting and focusing on real-world engagement is often the best strategy, probably the healthiest one. But for those users who, for whatever reason, time constraints, location, maybe just personal preference, choose to remain in the digital marketplace, then sticking rigidly to that research-backed, strategic approach we discussed becomes absolutely critical. It's the only way to have a fighting chance against a structure that's inherently designed for profitable failure. The apps are rigged, I'll concede that much, but maybe not impossible to beat if you treat them very carefully, like a highly specific, very time-limited screening tool, not a social life replacement.
So, to summarize my position, the data strongly suggests dating apps' business models prioritize profit through user retention, not user success. This economic reality inevitably leads to documented psychological harm, fatigue, cynicism, loneliness, and generally produces relationship outcomes that are measurably inferior to organic ones. Therefore, the most evidence-based path towards meaningful connection involves stepping away from the apps and investing that energy back into real-world activities and social networks.
And, my summary, while I fully acknowledge the structural design of these apps maximizes usage, often through that problematic hook and throttle cycle, they aren't an entirely closed-off path. They can still serve as a channel for meeting partners, but only if users approach them as highly efficient, strictly time-limited screening tools rather than their primary source of social interaction or validation. Yes, the incredibly low success rates reflect just how hard it is to find deep compatibility this way, but strategic, disciplined use can help individuals mitigate the worst psychological effects. Ultimately, though, the sheer amount of effort needed to beat the system really just underscores that fundamental tension between the app's need for profit and the user's desire for genuine connection.
Well, this debate certainly highlights the powerful economic forces that are actively shaping something as personal as our search for human connection.
And hopefully it gives listeners a clearer picture of the choice they face. Either commit to the demanding strategic rigor needed to maybe navigate this profitable frustration cycle, or perhaps redirect that finite time and energy towards methods that research suggests are more likely to foster genuine compatibility and ultimately higher quality relationships. Thank you for the discussion.